today I've brought you to the site of Eccles Mackin. This here is what an author, he wrote a essay about ancient agriculture in Scotland, and it was at Arthur's Seat, and it was this terracing here. And this is the kind of terracing you see in Asia, with the rice paddies and stuff like that. And when locals are asked about what these are, they usually come out with some drivel that they're seats to watch some kind of show. But I think this is possibly an excuse to get out of the fact that these are some of the most ancient terracing in the world. Like in Asia, they're protected by UNESCO. Here, they pretend they don't exist, and they give them stupid reasons for them. So they can put wind farms on them, so they can cut roads through them. Anyway, let's go and have a closer look. And we're going to have a closer look at this terracing. You can see here, guys. This was a very advanced way of growing crops. The terracing locks in nutrients in each of the stages of the steps. In Asia, they've got brickwork to keep this terracing, but here it seems to be just solid soil. Have a closer look at it, son. But doesn't seem to be any masonry. There might be if you dug underneath, but obvious this is terracing. So see here, it's a large slope, and back in ancient times this place would have been marshy and watery after the last ice age. So these hilltops were almost like islands. And this area around here is all marshland, it's all soggy, wet. You couldn't really grow anything around here. So the best place to grow was up in the hills, where the water naturally drained down there. You can see here, right round. And there's another thing about these hills as well, that they're usually south facing. So you usually find that these terraces, they get sunlight. And as you can see up here, guys, we've got a dry stone dike, or a dry stone wall. And this is the edge of probably what was a hill fort. This was made by the farmer, but there would have been an old wall. This would have been a border. There's no doubt that there would have been some kind of settlement on top of this hill, because most hills in Scotland had settlements on it. It was the best place to live at the time, especially when your lowland was soggy, you couldn't see the enemies. These were perfect to live upon. So most hills in Scotland, if you explore them, you'll usually find remains of some kind of ancient civilization, which is cool, which is pretty cool. Let's go. Okay guys, this is an example of a dry stone wall. The key characteristic of this wall is it doesn't have mortar. So there's nothing in between the bricks. There's nothing holding it together apart from sheer weight. And this is a style the ancients would have used as well. And modern farmers use this technique today. But God knows how old this wall here at the top of this hill is. This could be modern or ancient, I'm not sure. But this is obviously the border at the top of this hill that we're going to explore next. So we're in the Eccles Mackin area. St Mackin was meant to have visited this area, that's who the place is named after. And in the distance there you can see Binny Craig, an old fairy hill. Right, so we're walking around the hill where the terracing was. And look at this. Oh, it's dry now. It's warm today, but look at this. We've got the dry stain on this side. We've got this natural. Is it natural? Because it looks like blocks. That looks like blocks. This could be a man-made structure here, guys. Look at that. Look at those blocks. I don't think that's natural. What do you think, son? Natural or been put there? It looks like it's been put here to almost come up this hill. Like that wall is amazing. Right guys, walking around the hill we've discovered these huge blocks. People can say it's natural, but look at the spacing between each one. It's, to me, that's work by man's hands. And over here, and this, just to give you a comparison, these blocks are probably about 3 feet high, 2.5 feet high. Right guys, so further up the path here, I found more of these stones, and it looks like they're like a few inches thick. Same with that one there, almost like gravestone thickness, but they seem to have edged the pathway all the way up with these, so they might not be as thick as I thought. It's more like a facade, this stonework. So we're finding more of these. It's like a border stone. There we go there. Lots of beasties flying around.
Just like a bullet flying out of top.
Can we see anything? It seems to be all the way up here. See the other prominent hills over there, the houses. There's always a burn nearby. Always a burn nearby these ancient settlements. Right guys, looks like we found a standing stone that's been used as a farmer's gate. You see the holes here they've put for this gate over here. This gate here, some kind of gate, but this is probably some kind of standing stone that stood on top. And as you can see, the side, we can try to rub the moss off. The side, it's had definitely man worked on it. I might come up here with a brush and get this brush good rushed out. Look at it, this side here, that here, this symbol here. It could be just, this could be a modern thing, but this has definitely been carved in. This. Wow, if you look on this side, you see there's a big indentation. And here, it's been carved in. It's almost like a hand. That's like the thumb, there. That's like the finger, like that. It's almost like a big hand. Right. Ancient dry stone wall being buried. So guys, we're on the other side of the hill. As you can see, some more terrace in here, and it's quite large, like I said. Big large. This is big enough. I'm a size 13 foot and it's much bigger than my feet. So you can see here, you could easily grow rows of ancient barley or rye or wheat, flax. Sun's there, so the sun, this area is still getting full exposure for the sun. So faint lines here of the terracing on this hill, and I might explore what that is over there. It's just quite a few cows on, and I'm looking for a bull. I don't think there is one. No doubt there would have been an ancient settlement on top of this hill in Eccles Mackin. there's no history of it. But that's what we're here to do, try and discover some of it at least, or reignite the interest in it. You see here too, this is obvious terracing again. So we're just going to explore this right here, but there's a young bull looking at us. I don't think he's a threat. He's a stocky little fella.
You always like jump on top of the wood stuff.
And just behind them you can see this ancient terracing. I think this is if I remember rightly, an old silver mine. I think it got filled up. As you can see here, is this an electrified fence? I'm not sure. It's a danger of death. Danger of death. I don't think it means electrified fence, I think it means
Danger of death.
this ditch down here. But I'm sure this is an old silver mine and they filled it back in again. I wonder what kind of plant that is. Or it had lead ore here. One of the two. It was lead ore and there's silver in this area. And there's Binny Craig in the distance. Another volcanic plug. You can see what kind of rock it is that sticks out right here. This is some rock that's been exposed on the edge. But you can see this would be creating a terrace in this rock. And it'd have to be. You can see this is just jutting out of the side of the hill. All this would have been water. Big walk right round it. earthworks here. Here, there's a ditch. And the well we discovered, I think it's a well, it's just over there. Hello people, how yous all doing? This is this article I was talking about. Well, it's more of a chapter in a book, but it's called The Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. And this was first published in 1850. And the subject is Antiquities, Scotland, periodicals. And the author is Chambers. Robert Chambers. Is Robert Chambers? Have a look. Sure it's Robert Chambers. It doesn't say here. Anyway, let's read it. Okay, on ancient terraces of cultivation, commonly called Daisses or Daisses, by Robert Chambers, Esquire, FSA, Scott. The author of this paper adverted to examples of such terraces described by Pennant as existing under the name of balks between Pallinsburn and Cornhill in Northumberland. In Scotland they are chiefly to be found in the Vale of the Tweed and neighbouring districts, and they are called daisies, i.e. bench seats. Purvis Hill is a farm about 8 miles below Peebles, rising from the left bank of the Tweed, and of course facing southwards. It belongs to the estate of the Horsburghs of Pern. The farmsteading, now deserted, is situated on a sort of platform on the hillside, 240 feet above the river. The steep hill face under the house is marked all the way down to the haw by the river's side, with terraces extending over the space of a quarter of a mile. These terraces are more distinct towards the west than towards the east. They declined considerably in the former direction, melting away irregularly upon the pastoral face of the hill. The road to the farmhouse ascends along one of them. The post road, about 50 feet above the haw, passes along a lower and less inclined one. At a point directly below the house, the number traceable is 12, including 2 short ones between the haw and the road. They are, in general, sharply defined, but a quantity of wood somewhat obscures them on a general view. It is evident that they are formed one arrangement for the whole space of ground between the river bank and the house, without any regard to enclosures or to roads. So here's a picture, a drawing of the terraces at Newlands. And like a lot of people were saying in the comments that it's something to do with quarrying and it's something. Well, you notice there is usually a link between quarries and these hills, but the quarries are a lot later. These hills were used for agricultural by the ancient people, and in modern times, in the Industrial Revolution, they were quarried and they were used for lime and stuff like that. So that you'll see multi-purposes to these hills, but the first purpose for these hills was agricultural, because of the surrounding areas was marshy and wet, so the best place to grow was upon the hills. Anyway, another equally marked series of terraces is found on a hill face close to Newlands Kirk in the west of Peeblesshire. They are at least 12 in number. They occupy a piece of the hill face commencing about 40 feet above the immediate banks of the line and extending upwards about 110 feet. The length of the entire space occupied is about the 1/5 part of a mile. The hill, which faces the west, bends outwards or rather comes to an obtuse angle, and the terraces are better marked to the north of this angle than to the south. They slope upwards from the north extremity to the angle and then descend in the other direction. Two couples, however, of those on the north face descend the south face united into one. There has been no great effort to regularity in the intervals. There are two of the intermediate banks more than twice the depth of the average of the rest. The faces of these banks are generally very steep, fully more, I should think, than the natural angle of 38 degrees which banks of loose material assume. The terraces have been formed out of the soil of the hill face, which is everywhere several feet in depth, and of a fine sharp quality. There is no trace of masonry in their construction. Some of the country people think that there are appearances of passages from one terrace to another, as in roads which ascend by a series of traverses, but I could not convince myself of the existence of any such peculiarity. The whole arrangement has apparently been one designed simply for cultivation, or as a piece of ornamental ground, and in favour of this latter idea there were till lately remains of an ancient house on the top of the hill, immediately over the centre of the terrace space. The farmer found many free stones among the ruins of this building, all of which he carried away and made use of. He also found among the ruins a fragment of a cairn. In respect of their connection with the building, these terraces resemble a similar group at Purvis Hill. Similar terraces exist at Kilbucco, also in Peeblesshire, or Kilbucco, and at Dunshire in Lanarkshire. In all of the three last instances, the situation is from 600 to 700 feet above level of the sea. There is a group of the same objects at the North Middleton in Edinburghshire. The hill behind Markinch is marked on its north face in this manner. A correspondent also described some such objects at Castle Semple in Argyllshire. Terraces evidently designed for cultivation are conspicuous on the south-east slopes of Aberseat, above Duddonston. A group of them near the Dunasby Pond is visible from the low grounds towards Musselburgh, being particularly well seen in summer evenings, when the descending sun brings them into strong light and shade. On a careful inspection, however, of this part of the hill, it is found that the whole space from the park wall at Duddonston westward to what Mr. Charles Maclaren calls the Loch Crag, and rising to a point within about 350 feet of the summit, as well as around Dunsapie, is more or less strongly marked by terraces, the only interruption being where the Queen's Drive has passed through vertical range and created for some space a new surface. They are conspicuous at the bleaching green set apart for the villagers and descend even to the edge of the loch. Towards the west, the Loch Crag has served as an enclosure, and from the point near the path where that line of cliffs stops short, down to the river, there has been a stone wall of which faint traces survive. Thus it is clear that the arrangement has preceded the existence of the present footpath to Duddonston. There is a subdivision about halfway between the Loch Crag and the bleaching green, though a doubt may be entertained if it be coeval with the terraces. Some of the terraces, both above and below the drive, are of a strongly marked character. It is quite evident that they have been carefully formed, with a facing of wall composed of rough blocks, and the faces of several are so well defined and steep that it is barely possible to climb them. They are in general tolerably level or undulated slightly, and it is evident that they have been formed as closely together as possible. What is remarkable, the pastoral ground over which they extend has many rough blocks scattered over it, such as would form an impediment in any kind of cultivation, but it may be doubted whether these have not fallen from the cliffs above since the time when the terraces were used in that way. The terraces here are described are certainly of great antiquity, and totally unrepresented in the modern usages of our country. The country people have no traditions regarding them, and are even under uncertainty as to their design and use. The idea that they were designed as seats for the multitudes assembled at plays and spectacles is more prevalent than any other notion of their having been fashioned for purposes connected with agriculture or horticulture, and yet no doubt can be rationally entertained that they were constructed for purposes of culture. This I deem sufficiently clear from the exact resemblance which they bear to terraces in other countries which we know to be formed for these purposes. Such terraces present themselves on the slopes near Boulogne, likewise along the rising ground above the Bergstrasse between Baden-Baden and Basel. The cultivation of the vine being the object held in view in the latter district. I observed some of such terraces on a hill face at Hamburg in Austria, near the borders of Hungary. We learn from Gary Lasso de la Vega that the ancient Peruvians practiced agriculture with an unusual degree of intelligence, having a system of laborious irrigation and forming terraces upon hillsides that were too steep for ordinary cultivation. These he calls alleys, and he describes them as constructed with retaining walls, somewhat inclined inwards. The description on the whole would be pretty applicable to the terraces on Arthur's Seat. Similar terraces are formed for cultivation in ancient Palestine, where the practice is still to some extent kept up. According to Dr. Royal, a series of low stone walls, one above another, across the face of the hill, arrested the soil brought down by the rains, and afforded a series of levels for the operations of the husbandman. This mode of cultivation is usual in Lebanon, and is not unfrequent in Palestine, where the remains of terraces across the hills in various parts of the country attest the extent to which it was anciently carried. This terrace cultivation has necessarily increased or declined with the population. If the people were so few that the valleys afforded sufficient for them, the more difficult culture of the hills was neglected. But when the population was too large for the valleys to satisfy with bread, then the hills were laid under cultivation. It is not, however, necessarily to be supposed that the plan of forming such terraces was derived by our country from any other, for it is one which would be suggested by natural circumstances to any people of a certain degree of intelligence and who had an inclination to a superior mode of tillage. As the whole object of the terrace form of culture, where it is now practised, is to retain the finer particles of soil, which otherwise would be washed down to the bottom of the slope, such may be presumed to have been the design held in view by our ancestors also. A wonder indeed arises at so much pains being taken with particular spots of ground in an early and it may be presumed barbarous age in places where, from the elevation above the sea level, nature is far from being kindly to the husbandman, and even, it may be further remarked, on slopes presented in by no means the most favourable directions. It is certainly curious to find such examples of cultural skill and care in the high pastoral territory of the south of Scotland, where it is generally believed that during long intermediate ages hardly any tillage was practised except upon the low alluvial grounds. Fields close beside the terrace slopes are now regularly ploughed, but we can well understand how inapt a native of Peeblesshire would be a century ago to imagine that the hill face of Penderick could ever be cultivated when he was so totally unaccustomed to see tillage in such a place. It must nevertheless be admitted that we are apt, from our recollections of Scottish agriculture, just before the period of the Cockburns, Camises, and Sinclairs, to underestimate the point to which had been brought to an age not very long antecedent. I was much impressed with this idea when I found, in a curious volume of the Maitland Club series, a return of the tines paid at the beginning of the 17th century on the farm of Corby Hill, in the south of Midlothian. It is a bleak slope of from 800 to 900 feet above sea, and with a northern exposure, where we might suppose that no ground had ever been ploughed till the days of turnip husbandry and protection. Yet it was an arable farm in 1627, when the tines were 6 furlets of beer and 3 furlets of oats. It is also often remarked with surprise that slopes in the Lammer Moors, now pastoral, and at such an elevation as to seem unfit for any other husbandry, bears marks of ancient ploughing. One very reasonable inference, therefore, from these terraces is that there had been an early period in the history of our country when either the intelligence or the exigencies of the people caused them to cultivate with extraordinary care pieces of ground which, in the early part of the 18th century, would have been left to pasturage at the best. It is indeed to be observed that these fragments of an ancient culture appear to have generally been connected with mansions. Such has undoubtedly been the character of the Purvis Hills and the Pendrick examples, and we suspect has also been the case with the Daisses or Daisies of Arthur's Seat, a point to which we must presently return. But though it may be established that all of them had been formed in connection with mansions, it would not greatly affect the conclusion that culture was then practiced in situations which, in an intermediate period, would have been deemed unsuitable. It rather enhances the effect of that conclusion, as showing elevated by no means sunny spots as then deemed fit for the pet culture and decoration which a man of distinction desired to practice around his residence. The remark which remains to be made regarding the terraces of Arthur's Seat is one of which I bring forward with considerable hesitation, and to which I only can reconcile myself by the hope which attends it, that it may be the means of eliciting either proof or disproof in either of which cases I shall think that a service has been rendered to archaeological science. It is well known to this society that in 1775 Sir Alexander Dick of Prestonfield, in dragging Duddesdon Lock for marl, brought up a weighty heap of swords, spears, and other lumps of brass, mixed with the purest of the shell marl. Likewise some large fragments of deer horns of an uncommon magnitude, also some human skulls and bones. The horns and the bones have not been preserved, but our society has the good fortune to possess upwards of 50 pieces of the swords, spearheads, and fragments of other weapons thus excavated from the lock. Sir Alexander Dick, who was a man of remarkable acuteness of understanding, observed that some of the lumps of brass had been half melted, and my conjecture says he is there had been upon the side of the hill near the lake some manufactory for brass arms of several kinds of which were a demand. This conjecture is countenanced by our learned secretary Dr. Daniel Wilson in his work on the prehistoric annals of Scotland. The discovery, he says, of gigantic deers, horns, and fragments of others, along with the weapons and masses of melted bronze, would seem to add to the probability that some considerable manufacture of such weapons had been carried on at some remote period on the margin of the loch, and that these were collected for supplying them with handles. It is solely under the shelter of these opinions that I venture to intimate the possibility that in the terraces which rise from the border of the lake to a point about 400 feet up the hill, we see the remains of the agricultural arrangements connected with the establishment in question. It requires no very fanciful antiquary to detect about the village, bleach field, and the adjacent ground the soft and mouldering appearance of dwellings which had once enlivened that beautiful spot. The fine shelter and exposure, the beauty of the lake, and the springs of excellent water which issue from the base of the hill would conspire to render the place attractive from an early period. What adds considerably to the probability of a bronze foundry having been placed here is the fact of two several findings of articles that kind having taken place close to the terrace ground, one of a pair of bronze leaf-shaped swords and another of two large spearheads and a small drinking cup. I have ascertained that the first of these findings took place just beyond the new apparent western limit of the terraces, and the other a little farther to the westwards. There is surely something to justify a modest amount of generalization in so many discoveries of bronze antiquities in connection with this spot. And my conclusion, therefore, is in favour of the probability that the Daisies of Arthur's Seat were formed by persons engaged in the business of forging weapons and ornaments in that early age which has been called the Bronze Period. Consequently, that to this era we must assign all the other examples of that peculiar mode of culture which have been noticed. If this hypothesis be substantiated, the Daisies will of course take their place amongst the very early antiquities of Scotland, and as further and most interesting proofs of a partial civilization in our country long antecedent to the times of written history.